During World War II, a secretive battle unfolded in the shadows, away from the chaos of the front lines. The Soviet Union's espionage network infiltrated almost every aspect of American society, including sensitive government research efforts, such as the Manhattan Project. These spies acquired highly classified information of immense value for the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program. Our story explores the treachery of the 4 spies working at Los Alamos, the Manhattan Project's weapons design laboratory. Their actions would alter the course of history. Welcome to Secrets in the Shadows, the Project Y Spies. As our story unfolds, it's essential to understand the dedication and resources America needed to meet the challenge of developing an atomic bomb. Los Alamos was just one site. The Manhattan Project employed more than 500,000 people at many installations all over the country. Together, this national team overcame unprecedented technical challenges and developed practical nuclear weapons designs very quickly. This is where our story begins.
I think one of the big, misnomers about the Manhattan Project, you always think about Los Alamos. This was a very small part of the Manhattan Project. So the scale was immense.
Really an effort that involved hundreds of places and thousands of people beyond just what was happening in Los Alamos.
As head of the Manhattan District during the war, I was responsible for the development of the atomic bomb.
You have to take your hat off to General Grove to organize, 100,000, 200,000 people in a matter of weeks.
Early on, they realized that not only did we need the large production facilities, Oak Ridge and Hanford, for the production of the fissile materials for atomic weapons, but we also needed a safe, secure, and in Los Alamos's case, isolated, secret laboratory to really not just to develop the theory of atomic weapons, but to take that theory and then develop it into atomic weapons that could be not only tested, but also delivered.
At Project Y, almost everything was a challenge. To use fissile material for the first time, which no one had. They'd only really discovered or made plutonium a few years earlier. So you're trying to design a weapon with material that you don't even know what it is. So it's really amazing to have basically nothing and design what they designed.
The automatic controls got it now. This time, Rob, the stakes are pretty high. It's going to work all right.
Oppenheimer had based decisions for Project Y on one thing: stop the war. Every decision made here, that was the goal. Stop the war, stop it as quickly as possible. It was an astronomically hard problem to solve.
On July 16, 1945, Los Alamos scientists performed the world's first nuclear test. Codenamed Trinity, the test produced a yield equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT detonating. Because of his spies, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union and one of history's greatest mass murderers, was well aware of the Manhattan Project's success.
Well, Trinity, this is something new. This is the first epoch of the nuclear age. Can you build an atomic bomb? Can you really make it work? So, since no one's done it, there's no equipment. In 1945, basically you had a Dumont oscilloscope and a Hewlett-Packard oscillator were about the only 2 big commercial electronic components. There's no diagnostic. So the labs, Los Alamos, had to build all their own equipment. And and you have to think what they're trying to do. You're trying to measure, something that's hotter than any place in the universe, a nuclear detonation, with radiation levels higher than probably any place in the universe. And it's all happening in, a couple of microseconds, millionths of a second. Oh, no problem. It shouldn't be that hard. The more you learn about nuclear diagnostics, the more you think, okay, this can't work. I mean, it's just too complicated, It's a really difficult thing to do.
At Project Y, the code name for the Los Alamos laboratory, the staff understood the importance of keeping technical development secret. As the war ended in 1945 and the existence of atomic bombs became public knowledge, government officials had no reason to believe security had been compromised.
One of the reasons that Los Alamos was chosen was because of its isolated nature, and that was for security. And that was driven really by wartime security concerns. Did people know about Los Alamos? Was it a secret? Well, listen, if you lived in New Mexico in 1943, Los Alamos, the activities going on, that was not secret. You could see trucks going, people moving back and forth, right? That was not the secret. The secret is, what were they doing there? People were vetted. So people who worked at the laboratory at Los Alamos, they would basically run background checks on people. They were checked. Their life stories were examined. If you were in the military, you could not choose to come to Los Alamos. So Los Alamos was specifically looking for machinists. They were looking for people who had experience with ordnance, high explosives. They were looking for electrical engineers. Those were the ones that were basically processed through Oak Ridge and sent to Los Alamos. I've been reading a lot of memoir accounts of people remembering what life was like. They weren't very happy initially because they were not allowed to leave. They couldn't leave Los Alamos. They could go perhaps as far as Santa Fe, but there was a real tight control over people getting out. And so that did cause some tension in the workforce and with the families. It's interesting because once people were allowed to go home or talk to their family and tell them in person what they were doing, that opened up a vulnerability.
Dr. Addison, Frank Addison. Get your clearance in the office. Anything wrong? Just a routine search.
During Project Y, we had, gates, guards and guns, fences around the laboratory. In fact, it wasn't even printed on the maps. If you see some of the old USGS maps from the 40s and 50s, Los Alamos was conspicuously absent, as were the roads leading up to the town site. And we really thought security would be found in having this isolation and in this kind of nothing gets in or out without the government's sort of monitoring mentality. And so anytime someone wanted to leave, they needed to pass. They might be followed down to Santa Fe to dinner. They would have their phone calls monitored. They would have their letters opened and read on the way in, on the way out. And we thought, as a government at the time, that we had total security and isolation. But of course, we didn't.
We were concerned about outside threats, but in reality, the threats were from within.
During the war, the Soviet Union had few resources to commit to an atomic bomb project. The country was fighting for its survival against the German army. Many believed it might take a decade or more for the Soviet Union to develop a weapon. Some felt the Soviet system might never succeed. But Stalin had given Lavrentiy Beria, the infamous head of the Soviet secret police, overall charge of his nuclear weapons program. How could a nation that had endured so much suffering quickly build one of the most complex weapons ever devised?
Hitler had invaded in June of 1941. The Soviet Union was reeling. It was desperately moving factories to the east to keep them out of the hands of the advancing Nazi army. And so the way to get information about an atomic weapon was to steal it.
More than 2 million men
plunged into a front 2,000 miles long, reaching from the White Sea to the Black. Their aim, the annihilation of the Red Army. Leningrad.
In World War II, America, we lost about 300 people a day, every day, from start to finish, if you just average it out. The Soviet Union lost 12,000 people a day. The Soviet Union was basically destroyed. So they really did not have resources, but I guess Laurenti Beria decided we're going to build a bomb. Beria ran his program by fear. If you don't do this, we'll kill you. But he had no problem, killing hundreds of thousands of people and imprisoning people. And much of their nuclear complex was built by slaves. But after the war, their country was annihilated. A lot of that information was put into the knowledge of it's going to take them 10 years to build a weapon. If you don't have to pay people or feed people and you don't care if your workers die, then you can get a lot of stuff done.
When they first learned that the British were working on an atomic bomb, the Soviet Union made getting information about that project the highest priority. I mean, they recognized very quickly this could be a war-altering weapon.
At the end of the 1940s, communism was spreading rapidly. And on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union secretly and successfully tested its first nuclear weapon. Codenamed Joe 1, this event drastically altered the geopolitical landscape. It quickly became apparent that the Soviet Union had infiltrated the Manhattan Project. America's most sensitive secrets had been compromised. It seemed nothing was beyond Stalin's grasp.
And between 1945 and 1950, the population of the planet that became communist went from a few percent to almost 1/3. So the communist influence spread really rapidly. With them publicly saying they're going to take over the world, and it looks like they're doing it, then the concern became very serious that if the Soviets get a nuclear weapon, would they use it to enhance the spread of communism?
The Soviet bomb that they tested was an exact copy of the American bomb that had been dropped on Nagasaki. And the Soviets got that information from espionage from Los Alamos. So it was a real shock when the Soviets exploded a nuclear weapon.
The spy information from the Manhattan Project, actually there was a lot of it in the Soviet Union. Knowing energy transfer, amount of high explosives, that is a massive help. It's basically you're bypassing a lot of the development.
Well, the scientists were surely important, but we know from material that has come out since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact is that the scientists would not have been able to build the bomb as quickly, as expeditiously, and as successfully as they did without the espionage.
Keratin, Yuri Keratin, is kind of the leader of the group, but the real kind of driving force behind it was Igor Kurchatov. He's the one who approved everything. One of the interesting things during the Manhattan Project, he would get anywhere from 20 to 200 pages of spy information a night on the Manhattan Project. So they got 80,000 pages of spy information. And he would sort through it to determine, what's useful, what's not useful. But he said he would be up every night, 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, so that he could give a review of what they got that day.
The greatest and most impressive display of might and power ever staged by Soviet Russia is held in famous Red Square, adjoining the Kremlin, as all the latest war machines of the Stalin regime roll by to cheer the Russian masses.
One of the interesting things, when I was working in the Soviet Union after the revolution and the Soviet Union collapsed and became Russia, that they had opened the Stalin files started to open them and decided to close them for another 75 years. If this comes out, the Pope would make Hitler a saint compared to what Stalin did. But some of the numbers, it depends on who you ask, but you're talking about 20 million people Stalin directly was responsible for their death, either by execution or imprisonment. Yeah, he probably killed more people himself than they lost in World War II. Giving a crazy person a bomb is never a good idea.
It was evident that the Soviet Union received vital nuclear weapons information from spies within the Manhattan Project. The Soviets codenamed their espionage effort Enormous, and Los Alamos was in its crosshairs. But what would drive a person to steal sensitive information and share it with a very dangerous adversary? John Haynes, a historian specializing in communism and Soviet espionage, provides tremendous insight into the motivations of these individuals. I think what we'll do now is kind of go back in time a little bit, because as we transition into the individual spies, I'd like to talk about why would somebody be interested in communism in the United States, for instance, or elsewhere in the 1930s. I mean, you know, we're doing our interview today in 2024. Communism's not mainstream. It's not something that's really talked about all that often, but it was a little bit different back then. Can you tell us, you know, again, why would somebody be interested in this very different ideology?
One was World War I. The human loss of that war was beyond imagination, and it left a generation of people extremely disillusioned with the leadership of the Western nations. And to a lot of people in Western Europe who were disillusioned with the nature of World War I, communism seemed to offer a shining alternative. But then came the Great Depression.
The Depression hits the United States in 1929, and in contrast, it's believed, there's all this propaganda that finds a receptive audience, that the Soviet Union is doing just fine economically. They're building a new society, not based on competition, but on cooperation. And so, I mean, it's all nonsense. But the fact remains that contrast between American immiseration and supposed Soviet prosperity is one factor.
American communism was never, in a sense, a mass movement the way it was in some European countries. Even at its maximum, the American Communist Party was only had about 80 or 90,000 members in the late 1930s. But it also had an intellectual allure for certain classes of people. So that provided a basis for Soviet espionage in the United States in the 30s and 40s.
Then Hitler invaded Austria, Czechoslovakia, and in 1939, Poland.
There's real fear that the world is going fascist. And the Soviet Union bears the brunt of the Nazi military machine. And so the Soviet Union is the only country that's standing up to Hitler, that's really fighting Hitler, that's inflicting damage on Hitler. And the United States should be giving the Soviet Union every bit of help that we could. And that includes information about atomic weapons.
While world politics and ideology certainly play a role in someone's espionage behavior, as a psychologist, what I'm concerned with are things like personal history, life stressors, financial stressors may influence someone to join the Communist Party or to commit acts of espionage against the United States.
Thanks to the persistence of John Haynes, files pertaining to America's effort to crack Soviet codes were declassified and made public in the 1990s. Back in the late 1940s, the Venona program, as it was called, successfully identified several Soviet espionage assets in the United States.
Venona was probably the most successful American counterintelligence operation, certainly of the Cold War and perhaps of the 20th century. It was a remarkable achievement by American cryptographers.
It originally was started as an attack on Soviet diplomatic cables.
And we had an enormous trove of material to search through. According to wartime censorship rules, all international cables going out into and out of the United States had to be turned over to the government. And the Soviet Union communicated between, obviously, Moscow and its embassies and consulates in the United States using cables, Western Union. And there were hundreds of thousands of Western Union cables that American intelligence had collected. Now, the Soviets were confident that these cables could not be read because they were both encoded and encrypted. And the Soviets used something called a one-time pad. One-time pad was simply a packet of sheets, very thin sheets, which had maybe 40 or 50 random numbers on it.
What makes it unbreakable is that once that one page is used up, it's torn up, burned, gotten rid of, never used again, which is why they call it a one-time pad. And because of that, there's virtually no repetition. And it's unbreakable.
You then have a message that is in a unique code. But American cryptanalysts began to break into the messages. And they did so because the Soviets made a gigantic mistake.
One-time pads had to be constructed by hand. Well, as you can imagine, that's extremely labor-intensive. So June 1941 comes, the Nazis attack the Soviet Union. Soviet cable traffic from their diplomatic offices and their intelligence offices and all their offices all around the world explodes. The code-making agency in Moscow couldn't keep up. There was a shortfall that lasted nearly a year. One-time pads became two-time, three-time, four-time pads.
And if they found two messages that had been encrypted using the same page of the one-time pad, they could strip those messages, or at least parts of those messages, of the random numbers, and they then had the code. Then they had to reconstitute the Soviet code book, which they did. They were aided because the Finns, who had fought a war with Russia in the late 30s, early 40s, had captured a partially burned Soviet code book that they turned over to the United States.
Who would have the ability to scoop up millions of cables and compare them and spot that there was duplication occurring? Well, there is someone who has the ability to do that, the United States. And if there's duplication, they can be broken.
Out of several 100,000 messages, they only broke into all or part of about 3,000. And that was over 25 years. They made enough breakthroughs that they slowly began to add people to the project, but it still was highly secret. They did not want news of this project to get out, even within the Army Security Agency.
And one of the earliest messages broken actually dealt with the Manhattan Project that briefly outlined who were the major scientists then working at Los Alamos.
Bethe, Fermi, Fuchs, Oppenheimer. Well, these are people working on the atomic bomb. It's not public information. How'd they get that information? A spy. What that said is in 1944, 1945, the Russians had inside information on Los Alamos.
There were other sources of information besides Venona. For instance, a notebook was written by former disgruntled KGB officer Alexander Vasilyev. The atomic spies from Project Y were exposed using both sources. There were 4 spies at Los Alamos: Theodore Hall, David Greenglass, Klaus Fuchs, and Oscar Seborer. The first spy to steal secrets from Los Alamos was Theodore Hall. He was codenamed Malad.
Ted Hall was not publicly identified as a Soviet spy until after the Venona material was released in 1995.
Ted, growing up in New York as a teenager in the 1930s, did develop an interest in communism.
When he got to Harvard, his roommate was a guy named Saville Sachs, who himself was a communist.
Ted was brilliant. Graduated from Harvard at 18. That's when most people are entering Harvard. And he was a physics prodigy.
Hall was, had still not graduated from Harvard when he was recruited for Los Alamos. Hall gets out to Los Alamos. He's the youngest physicist there. And he immediately is given a position of responsibility, and there are a lot of bright physicists at Los Alamos, and he was certainly one of them, one of the best. He worked on implosion.
The first time he got leave on returning to New York, he talked about it with his friend Saville Sachs. And they were both agreed that they had to get this to the Soviet Union as soon as possible.
And he tells him what they've been doing, and Hall says, I've written something up about it, and we've got to find somebody that we can give it to, a Russian that we can give it to. And they decide that it's a little risky to go to the Soviet consulate, in New York, which may be under surveillance. So the two of them embark on this madcap dash around New York, trying to find a Soviet spy. You think about it, you have to be probably a naive 19-year-old to do this kind of stuff. Can you go up to somebody and say, can you put me in touch with a Soviet spy?
In espionage terms, so that's known as a walk-in. So someone who's not recruited, they volunteer and say, I'm here to spy. Walk-ins are always suspect.
A couple people that he talks to say, well, you should really talk to this guy, Sergei Kornikov. Sergei Kornikov was a correspondent for TASS, the Soviet press agency. And we have the details of their meeting because Kornikov wrote a lengthy report, which he sent to Moscow, which is in Vasilyev's notebooks. So Saville Sachs figures, well, I've got to nudge things along. They haven't heard from Kornikov. So Saville Sachs does go to the consulate, and he meets with senior Soviet intelligence officer.
He decided that Hall was the real deal, and that he was in fact a prodigy, that he did know what he was talking about, and that he was a sincere communist, and he wanted to deliver whatever secrets he could.
Saville Sachs will be your courier, and we'll send him out to pick up material. So a month or 2 months later, Saville Sachs travels out to Santa Fe. He meets with Hall. He gets a report from Hall. He takes a newspaper and writes information that Hall has given him on the newspaper in invisible ink. When he gives it to the Soviets and they decrypt it, they can't read half of it. So the Soviets decide, this guy's not a good courier. We need a more experienced courier. So they recruit Cohen. Later, she goes out to Santa Fe and meets with Hall and gets a lot more information from him. After he was exposed, Hall justified what he had done by saying that I, Ted Hall, am a hero. I prevented World War III. He said, I was convinced that after World War II, the United States would turn fascist. And if the Soviet Union did not have nuclear weapons, the United States would use them on the Soviet Union. So I think that I did the right thing.
We understand a little bit now about the ideology of some of the spies from Project Y. And I guess when it comes to spying and the why, that's what people mostly want to know is why would you betray your country? Why would you betray the trust and the information that you've been given to a foreign government? And the truth of it is that when it comes to motivations, there really is nothing new under the sun. It comes down to ideology, ego, money, blackmail, and overwhelming life crisis or something going on in someone's life that they feel there's no way out. Sometimes it really is about a disagreement with an employer or the direction of an organization or the mission of an organization. Espionage has changed much over the years, and much of it happens in the virtual world today. It's cyber-based, it's email-based, it's based on social networking platforms and other online mediums. But the motivations ultimately are the same.
Ted Hall was a very young, very intelligent physicist working at Project Y. He provided the Soviet Union with information pertaining to both weapons under development, the plutonium implosion bomb, Fat Man, and the enriched uranium gun-type bomb, Little Boy. Our next spy is David Greenglass, codenamed Caliber.
So Greenglass was in the military. He was already working as a machinist. So he was brought to Oak Ridge as well, also for about 2 weeks, also vetted while he was at Oak Ridge, and then brought to Los Alamos. And again, machinists, especially machinists with ordnance experience, were absolutely critical to the work developing the implosion weapon. Absolutely.
Greenglass, when he gets sent to Los Alamos, when he learns he's going to be sent there, he tells his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg. He says, okay, that's really interesting news. Rosenberg contacts his KGB superior and says, my brother-in-law is going to be at Los Alamos.
The machinists were really important because they had to work closely with the scientists who were not machinists to develop these prototype parts for the weapons.
Julius and Ethel invite Ruth Greenglass to their apartment in New York on the Lower East Side. We know about this meeting because Julius wrote up a report about it, and it's in the Vasiliev notebooks. And Ethel, according to Julius's report, Ethel presses her, says, yes, it's really important that David do this. I know he'll want to do it. You have to persuade him to do it. Ruth Greenglass agrees, and she goes out to Albuquerque and gets an apartment, and David comes to the apartment, and David agrees to spy.
He machined, as they were working on the implosion lens, he machined parts for it as they were testing what worked and what didn't work. So he could provide information on what he was doing. Now, there is in the Vasiliev notebooks a message where it said on one of his, when he went back to New York in 45 on leave, he actually brought back a part of the trigger mechanism.
I think that Greenglass's contributions to the overall knowledge was just one piece of the puzzle. It was more the hands-on.
Greenglass winds up going to Los Alamos is just sheer chance.
During Project Y, we saw networks of spies. For example, David Greenglass and the Rosenbergs, right? A family of spies that all worked together for a foreign government, in this case, the Soviets. So today, we still see similar things happen. We see foreign governments exploit family connections. They can use family as leverage. They can also use them as a bond of affection and someone that you trust and you want to work with. Families might have a similar ideology, but in this case, we see them occasionally do that type of leveraging. That's one of many examples throughout history and even recent history where we see families work together in espionage.
During Project Y, no one could leave, and one wonders about the psychological implications of remaining, living and working in a closed environment with people you may or may not have gotten along with and how those conflicts were resolved. With David, he had requested leave fairly early on into his stay at Los Alamos, but he was denied that leave, and he was damned angry about it. And he also made a veiled threat after that if they think I'm not going to do anything about it, they're wrong. And so that grievance potentially could have contributed to his acts of espionage, feeling like he had been served an injustice by Project Y.
These spies were rather insouciant about what they were doing. I mean, David Greenglass is a guy with a high school education. He never really stopped to consider what he was doing or the risks that he was taking for his family. He admired Julius, and he was a fervent communist, so he did it.
Our next spy is Klaus Fuchs, who operated under the code names Rest and Charles.
He was a brilliant young physicist. He finished his studies in England and recruited into tube alloys, which is the name the British had for their atomic bomb project, which predates our Manhattan Project.
First couple of years, from 1941 through 1943, most of the information that the Soviets obtained about the atomic bomb came from the British, from their spies in Great Britain. And there were several of them, and they were very, very significant. One who comes into the story in the United States in 1944 is Klaus Fuchs.
And a decision was made to send a large delegation of British scientists to work on various aspects of the project. Fuchs was selected by the British as part of their delegation.
Klaus Fuchs was probably the most damaging atomic spy. Not only had he been present in Great Britain in the early days of the work on the atomic bomb, but he came to the United States. He was in the New York laboratory for a while, and then he's sent to Los Alamos, where he is one of the senior scientists. He's working on implosion.
And Klaus was very instrumental in a lot of the early calculations, all the physics part of implosion, and of the of both gun and implosion weapons. So he was probably one of the top scientists. I mean, he was probably one of the top 4 or 5 people in the design of the implosion bomb. He basically knows everything.
I was recently working on a project where we were looking at Klaus Fuchs' notebooks. And as I was looking at the original documents, his original documents, pages and pages of physics calculations, Fuchs was really brilliant.
The one interesting thing, if you look at all the patents of the early nuclear weapons, Klaus is on just about all of them. Klaus was involved in just about everything on design of a nuclear weapon.
After the war, he goes back to Great Britain, where he eventually winds up as the senior scientist at Harwell, where the British are working on their atomic bomb. And he was senior enough that he had access to a huge number of secrets and sensitive information.
You know, old school espionage, it might be a case officer or a foreign agent meeting an asset somewhere in an alley, with a dead drop or some kind of a quick exchange of information that was printed. Today that can be done online, and it's much harder to detect, and we have to work extra hard to look for those mechanisms that allow people to communicate information online to our adversaries without ever leaving their home, without ever leaving the United States. We're fortunate at the Office of Counterintelligence at LANL to have a staff of well-trained experts in CI, individuals that have spent their careers working at places like FBI, CIA, Department of State, Homeland Security, Department of Defense, doing counterintelligence all over the world. And they are consummate professionals that have seen just about everything that can be done with CI and are very good at what they do. And so to adversaries or anyone that may be undertaking espionage, I can say that we will find you. And we have found people and will continue to find people. We'll neutralize the threat and do all we can to protect national security. We're pretty formidable when you look at who we employ and the capabilities that we have as an office.
Thanks to the diligent work of John Haynes and Harvey Clare, a fourth spy was unmasked in 2019. Known as Godsend, the story of Oscar Seborer's wartime work has been revealed using documents from the Los Alamos National Laboratory's National Security Research Center. Tell us about your discovery of the fourth spy at Los Alamos.
Well, the first hint that we had that there might have been one was from Vasilyev's notebooks. And in Vasilyev's notebooks, you find a couple of lines about a network called Relatives Group.
In Vasilyev's notebooks, in 1947, there's a message from Moscow sent to New York, to the KGB folks in New York, saying, you know, we're not getting any more information on the American atomic project. And we know that they're making advances, but you're not getting us anything. This needs to be rectified. And there are instructions about several things that they need to do. And they said, try reactivating the relatives group. I was going through some just declassified FBI files about a project called Operation Solo, which was another great American counterintelligence success of the Cold War. And it began in 1952 when the FBI recruited two brothers to be undercover FBI agents in the Communist Party of the United States.
Well, these were, of course, wonderful sources for the FBI to have into the political activities of the American Communist Party.
The two brothers were Morris and Jack Childs, who were both longtime members of the Communist Party and pretty significant figures in the party. Morris was a public figure, and his brother Jack had been prominent in the party's underground apparatus. They were recruited, and the FBI knew every step the American Communist Party was taking and making. The Soviets were paying the American Party millions of dollars a year, and the people they were paying it through were the Childs brothers.
He was approached by an old communist colleague of his who he had known for many, many years.
Ask Tim Buck, who was the head of the Canadian Party, if he can use his contacts in the Soviet Union to find out about Oscar Seborer and his brother Stuart. And Jack says, well, you know, I got to know, I mean, why I'm going to be asked, what's this about? What's so important about this? He says, well, during the war, Oscar was stationed in New Mexico.
I said, well, okay, well, a lot of people in New Mexico in World War II, so what? I mean, New Mexico, don't you get it?
What more do you want me to say? He gave them the secret of the atomic bomb.
We realized we were looking at Relatives Group.
So Jack reports this to the FBI. And so the FBI is confronting a dilemma. They can't be too aggressive here. Jack Childs is one of their two most important undercover operatives in the American Communist Party. So they very carefully try to find out what's going on, and they established that Oscar indeed had been at Los Alamos.
Once we learned that Oscar Seborer was potentially a spy at Los Alamos, as a historian, my task was to look at our records, to go into the vault, go into the archives, and see what we could find on Oscar Seborer, and really focus on, if he was indeed a spy, what could he have contributed to the story? He was a skilled electrical engineer. He is immediately sent to work on aspects of the implosion weapon. Because of his expertise with working with circuits He is sent to Trinity early on, and he was so supportive of the work at the Trinity site for the 100-ton test. Once he came back to his parent group, there were memos going back and forth. We want this guy, we don't want this guy. We really, really want Oscar Seborer to help us with the Trinity test. In fact, the Trinity test director, Kenneth Bainbridge, specifically asked for Seborer because he was extremely valuable. Extremely valuable. Those were Bainbridge's words. We were very excited to find a floor plan of the main control center for the Trinity test, the South 10,000 bunker. This is where Oppenheimer was during the test. This is where Kistiakowsky was during the test. This is where the important people were, and it was the main controlled center. So in early July, a preliminary space assignment memo is generated, and it lists the people who are going to be in that main control area. He was on the space assignment graphic.
So with further research, I found a document that indicates he probably wasn't in the main control building, but we're probably sure that he was at base camp and did see the Trinity test.
Because he had possibly knowledge of assembly methods, possibly a lot more knowledge of the X unit than anyone else. So Fuchs was more theoretical, but Seborer's was more hands-on. He might have had access to Delta Building, and he could have definitely, I think, seen how weapons were assembled, because that's what his parent group, that's what their focus was on. So that was probably knowledge that was important to transmit.
So the Soviets have it covered. They've got spies in just about every significant facility of the Manhattan Project.
What the Soviets got from espionage was they now knew what worked. So they could build the bomb much quicker and at a fraction of the cost, which was important to the Soviets because the Soviet Union, most of its industrial base in ruins.
Although we know Oscar Seborer shared the laboratory secrets with the Soviet Union, it's likely he did not share information with the Soviet Union during his employment at Project Y. In the early 1950s, Seborer and close family members immigrated to the Soviet Union. In 2015, he died in anonymity in Moscow. John, you've described a lot of puzzle pieces for us. You've talked about Venona. You've told us about each of the 4 spies that we know of that were at Los Alamos. Can you connect them all together now and tell us what happened to them?
Fuchs, Hall, and Greenglass were identified quite early. And it all stems from Venona. The broken Venona messages identified Fuchs fairly quickly. There are a number of messages about him, and it didn't take a lot of work on the FBI's part to figure out that it was Klaus Fuchs. Now, by the time they did figure it out, of course, he had left the United States. He was back in Great Britain and was working on the post-war British atomic program. And by the way, he had reestablished his connection with Soviet intelligence and was spying on the British program. MI5 assigned one of their best interrogators. He met with Fuchs several times, and over the course of these meetings, Fuchs broke and confessed. One of the things he provided in his interrogation was some information on his courier in the United States, Harry Gold. He provided information on when he met him and where he met him and some of his personal characteristics. And the descriptions that are in Venona, which by themselves probably would not have identified Gold, fit with what Fuchs had said and their own investigation. They interviewed Gold, and He broke almost immediately.
Harry Gold is seen here in Philadelphia just after he'd been granted postponement of extradition to New York for trial. He's accused of passing atomic secrets to Russia, having, it's alleged, acted as a go-between for Dr. Fuchs, the scientist convicted as a traitor in Britain. Gold is reported as saying, "I meant no harm to America."
And that led to Greenglass. Again, Greenglass is in Venona, but probably it would have been difficult to identify him fully from that. Normally, a courier never deals with anything more than one person at a time.
Zarubin, Gold's KGB superior, sends, "We want you to go back out and get information from Fuchs about, what they've learned since the bomb has been dropped. And as long as you're going, we've got another spy who's working at Los Alamos, who's going to be visiting his wife in Albuquerque at that time. Why don't you stop by in Albuquerque and pick that information up?" And Gold is an experienced courier. He says, "Bad idea." You don't use one courier to pick up information from two spies. You're intermingling two networks. Don't do it. And then we got to get this information. It's important. So Gold does it. He picks up material from Fuchs in Santa Fe, goes down to Albuquerque, and gets the information from David Greenglass.
And it didn't take the FBI much effort to figure out, okay, we got an Army sergeant who has a wife in Albuquerque and who has leave at a certain time. So they got Greenglass. And they interviewed him. He broke because they had him dead to rights. And furthermore, they not only had him, they had his wife. Well, he made a deal. All right, I'll not only identify, but testify against my recruiters, my sister and my brother-in-law, the Rosenbergs.
His sister Ethel, who apparently adored him greatly and had a very close relationship with him when he was growing up. But during the course of events, he was simply using Ethel to serve his own means, which was to keep Ruth out of prison, and so that their two children would not grow up for any period of time without their parents.
David Greenglass, Mrs. Rosenberg's brother, confessed theft of the secrets while stationed at the Los Alamos atomic project. He later became the government's chief witness in the prosecution of Sobel and the Rosenbergs. It is a stern jurist they face in Judge Irving Kaufman.
With the Rosenbergs, if the Venona material had been introduced in court, there never would have been any doubt about Julius and Ethel's guilt. You had the testimony of Harry Gold. You had the testimony of David Greenglass, of Ruth Greenglass. In a lot of other cases, you didn't have that independent corroboration. So the American judicial system makes it difficult to convict people. And espionage is a crime that's carried out in secret.
But the Rosenbergs, both Ethel and Julius, refused to break, denied everything. They got the death penalty. They were told up to the very last, listen, if you will cooperate, you won't be executed. They preferred to die.
One of the greatest peacetime spy dramas in the nation's history reaches its climax as Julius Rosenberg and Morton Sobel, convicted of revealing atomic secrets to the Russians, enter the federal building in New York to hear their doom. Another of the spy ring, Mrs. Ethel Rosenberg, who with her husband was convicted of actually transmitting the secrets to Russia through Soviet diplomatic channels. He sentenced both Rosenbergs to death in the electric chair and Sobel to 30 years in prison.
Ted Hall is a perfect example. The government knew he was a spy because of a Venona message. The message when Kornikov recruited him, it said, "I have recruited Ted Hall." They had his name in plain text.
The FBI anticipated that they would interview him and he might break. And Saville Sachs, who had made one courier run to him out here, that he would break. They denied everything.
Where's your evidence? You don't got it. You don't got anything.
Now, in the case of Seborer, as he had left with his brother, at the time of the Rosenberg's arrest, they decided to get out of Dodge. And they left for the Soviet Union, and they stayed there the rest of their lives.
You know, Venona revealed a lot of American spies. Very few of those that it revealed were ever prosecuted, partly because the government had to develop other evidence besides Venona. They would not use Venona in court. Part of it was considerable doubt that Venona material would have been admissible. You'd have to explain every step in the decrypting process, that is exposing the way American cryptanalysts worked. I mean, it would have exposed the methods that we used, and the government was not willing to do that.
In addition to infiltrating the Manhattan Project, spies also infiltrated other parts of the United States government. Their espionage had dire consequences for national security.
The Venona Project, like just about every other intelligence or counterintelligence operation the United States mounted during the Cold War, was the object of Soviet efforts to infiltrate it. Soviets found out about it relatively early. We know that in 1944, a man named Lachlan Curry, who was one of 6 presidential assistants to Franklin Roosevelt. Curry reported to his Soviet handler that he had heard rumors that the Army was working on a project to decode Soviet communications. The next horrid discovery came around 1948-49. In the course of interrogating an aviation engineer, had been a Soviet agent, Soviet source. In the course of interrogating him, he told them about the guy that had picked up information from him. And when the FBI began to dig into it, they came to a really disconcerting conclusion. The person this guy was talking about was a man named William Weisband. Weisband was working at Arlington Hall on the Venona project. Weisband, sometime in '48, and he says, "You got a problem. The Army is making enormous strides in decrypting this material." And shortly after that, what the intelligence people have called Black Friday, one day, all Soviet communications that we had been reading, and it was not just Venona, because Venona referred to stuff that had been going on years before. This was current intelligence material. All of that, as they said, went black. They couldn't read it. The Soviets changed their codes. If Venona had been the greatest counterintelligence coup for the US government in the 20th century, this was perhaps the greatest disaster, because this was the run-up to the Korean War. And we were totally unable to read Soviet communications. We now know that Joseph Stalin and Kim Il-sung, the North Korean leader, were communicating about Russian support for a Korean invasion of the South. And the Soviets would have had to have been sending huge numbers of messages about logistic movements, troops, all those kinds of things. We had no clue about it, so that we were taken really utterly by surprise by the beginning of the Korean War.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. This attack has made it clear beyond all doubt that the international communist movement is willing to use armed invasion to conquer independent nations, an act of aggression.
On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, sparking one of the deadliest armed conflicts of the Cold War. The statistics of this war are staggering. It's likely millions died including tens of thousands of American soldiers.
It's one thing that if one of Stalin's successors had gotten the atomic bomb. It's another thing when Joseph Stalin gets it. Joseph Stalin with the bomb frightened a lot of people because, by the end of the 1940s, Stalin was recognized as one of the most ruthless leaders in the world. Further, we also know it played a role in Stalin's own decision-making, namely Korea.
Remember, Stalin dies, in 1953? If the Soviets had been unable to develop an atomic bomb until after Stalin died, would the history of the world have been different? Would his successors have okayed a North Korean invasion? No, you can't answer that question. We can't answer that question. But the fact that Stalin had an atomic bomb clearly factored into his decision to approve the beginning of the Korean War.
We're talking about millions dead. The Korean War was a blood-soaked catastrophe for that part of Asia. Those Soviet sources, Hall, Fuchs, Greenglass, Seborer, as well as, remember, there were a couple of Soviet spies at Oak Ridge and some other places. They contributed to the bringing about the Korean War.
Those people that say, well, the espionage didn't matter, I think are living in a dream world. Somebody that says that think they know more than very hard-boiled Soviet politicians, military people, and scientists who understood how valuable the espionage was.
The espionage of the Project Y spies enabled the Korean War to unfold. One must wonder if Hall, Greenglass, Fuchs, and Seborer ever realized their actions would help lead to the deaths of so many. It's important to remember these consequences from the past at our laboratory today as we work to protect our nation's secrets.
Russia's defense ministry has released the first video showing an underwater test of its Poseidon nuclear-powered drone. The clip.
So what concerns me today when I think about counterintelligence is the geopolitical situation in the world today, right? It's often maybe oversaid that these are complicated times, but I think that truly applies to right now, to today where we're at. The cyber world also makes it much easier for people to reach into Los Alamos, right? It's hard to rely on our geography anymore when the truth of it is that from any office in the laboratory or a home computer in town, you can be reached from anywhere in the world. No one has to even travel here to do that. Insider threat is an issue. It's always been an issue. It's that breaking of the trust that we give employees with a badge and with a security clearance to say that they'll protect the information that they learn about here. But suffice to say that we have ways of knowing when people are doing things they shouldn't be. It's best for employees to come forward and tell us about issues they might see with a fellow colleague. But I think, cyber combined with the geopolitics of the world today make it very complicated, yet very interesting times to work in counterintelligence.
What we do at Los Alamos remains vitally important to global security. And just like during the days of the Manhattan Project, our secrets are still sought by very dangerous adversaries. The threat is real.